Good afternoon, everyone. We're almost there. We're almost to the cocktail hour. All right, so welcome to the last session of the convention. This session was really born out of your feedback from surveys that we sent out. We do read them. We do listen. We read every comment in there, and there were a number of families and patients and caregivers that wrote to us and suggested, can you please have a session about the diagnosis of HD? Why is it still diagnosed as a motor disease? And this session was born out of your comments. So joining us today are two HDSA Center of Excellence directors, one Dr. Sam Frank, who will get us started, and he'll be talking more about why is HD still diagnosed as a motor disease, what's currently done. And Dr. Chris Ross will follow from Johns Hopkins, talking about what's being done to change those criteria potentially and incorporate all the other symptoms that we know, both from the motor, the cognitive, and the psychological, that are all at play in HD. So first off is Dr. Sam Frank. Currently, he was last year at BU. Now he's a movement disorder neurologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts. Following him is Dr. Chris Ross, who's currently a professor of psychiatry, neurology and pharmacology and neuroscience at Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore, Maryland. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam to get us started.
Thank you, George. So I'm going to get us started, and then Dr. Ross is going to continue. And we really want this to be a discussion, to open this up, because this is an important issue. And this is not a debate. We're not coming up here and talking about two different sides. I really wanted to talk a little bit about the history and why it is at this point that we still diagnose Huntington's disease as a motor disease. And then Dr. Ross is going to go more into the future in terms of diagnosis and beyond motor aspects of Huntington's disease. So I want to go into a little bit of background and history in terms of how we diagnose the disease. I want to go into a little bit of the motor symptoms, because I think often when we talk about motor disease, we're thinking about one aspect of the motor symptoms, and it's a lot more. And then the use of the motor diagnosis in clinical trials and through regulatory bodies and for disability. And then Dr. Ross is going to go into expanding the diagnostic criteria. So I put this up here because when I put into my code, a little code in the computer, the code for Huntington's disease, often Huntington's chorea comes up, right? And I often tell medical students that Huntington's chorea is the old name for the disease, because we know that it's a lot more than chorea. And so I think that everyone in this room feels a little bit of angst, disgust, a little cringe when we hear that term, because it's more than chorea. And it's in terms of the motor symptoms of Huntington's disease, obviously chorea is the biggest that everybody thinks about. It's what's taught in terms of graduate medical education and in medical schools and nursing schools. So we think about chorea, but there are other involuntary movements that are involved in Huntington's disease. And one of the largest ones, when you suppress chorea, a lot of the dystonia, which is extra muscle contractions that causes posturing, becomes a little bit more obvious. It's there for those of us that assess it, even with the presence of chorea, but it becomes even more obvious when you suppress. And then Parkinsonism is really, it's either a slowness, and for those of you that have senior neurologists and have done this kind of testing, right, so that's what we're looking for. I'm seeing a lot of nodding of heads. And as well as just our gauge of what's your overall movement. And so what are the voluntary movements that are there? What are the gestures like? Or is the person just kind of sitting like someone with Parkinson's disease with a lack of voluntary movements? I also put in speech as part of the motor symptoms, because I think that there's the motor task of forming speech from the lips to the tongue to the palate, as well as coordinating the chest musculature and diaphragmatic movements. And similarly, swallowing issues is really more of a muscle contraction and more for the motor symptoms of Huntington's disease. And a lack of coordination, the medical term for that is ataxia, is also common in patients. So the motor symptoms of Huntington's disease are beyond chorea. Similarly, when we measure Huntington's disease, it's beyond chorea. And so this is, many of you have probably heard in the context of research, the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. It's actually 6 parts. There are 6 parts to the UHDRS, and 1 part is the motor exam. And so this is what we assess in terms of the motor exam. Again, this is beyond just kind of limb and trunk movements. It's eye movements. What's the slur? What's the speech like? Tongue protrusion time, finger taps, hand movements. How much stiffness is there? How much slowness is there? Again, that dystonia. And chorea, we do measure chorea. And just to give you an idea, of the 6 parts, and the motor exam is just 1. On the motor exam, the chorea is 7 of the 31 items that we measure. So it's a substantial minority is what I would say, but it's a clear minority in terms of everything that we look at on the motor exam. How people walk, both in terms of their regular walking as well as that heel-to-toe walking that we call tandem, and what's the balance test doing. So it's a broad range of motor symptoms. It is beyond chorea, even what we measure. At the very end of the motor part of the Unified Huntington's disease is diagnostic confidence level. So this goes back a long ways, but it is asking the clinician, whether it's in the context of clinical or clinical research, what's the diagnostic confidence level? So to what degree are you, and you meaning the clinician, confident that this person meets the operational definition of unequivocal presence of an otherwise unexplained extrapyramidal movement disorder? So there are other reasons that people might have extra movements. And so if it's a totally normal exam, it's 0. Non-specific motor problems or less than a 50% confidence, so maybe someone has a little stiffness in one arm and that's it, then that's a 1, and all the way up to a 4, which are motor abnormalities that are unequivocal signs of Huntington's disease, meaning a 99 or greater % confidence that this person is presenting with the signs of Huntington's disease based on motor symptoms alone. So this is just one question that is part of the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. At the end of all 6 parts, there's this question. So there are 80 different individual items on the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, and this is the last one. And it is based on the entire Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. So that includes the motor, the cognitive, the behavioral, and the 3 functional components. Do you believe with a confidence level of 99% or greater that this subject, meaning research participant, has manifest Huntington's disease? And it's a yes or no. It's not a confidence level. So even as part of how we measure Huntington's disease in terms of the scale, there is a notion that this is beyond motor and looking at everything. I do want to emphasize that there are other causes of chorea, and Huntington's disease is just one that's on the list. And so when people present with chorea, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is, by definition, Huntington's disease. So there are other diseases that we need to think about, some which even have a genetic component and can look identical to Huntington's disease. So that's where there can be some question based on other issues or family members or laboratory testing. So this morning, in terms of the research, we heard multiple times that we need something observable, right? We want to observe some type of outcome to look at when we give someone an intervention and see, does it change? And I think it's only human nature to look at the motor side of things and see that that's observable. And so I think that's one of the reasons that there's been a focus on the motor side of Huntington's disease. It's also, relatively speaking, objective. There's something called a Q-motor exam. There are other ways that we're looking into more objective ways to measure movement. Not that there aren't objective ways to measure some of the other aspects of Huntington's disease, but it's been a little easier for longer to look at the motor side of things. It's measurable, it's clear, and from a development side of things, there's been a history of success getting drugs approved and moving forward with clinical trials based on motor criteria. The other thing is that I put up here most neurologists are familiar, but most physicians, I would say, and physician extenders are familiar with the neurological examination. And they can do that in less time than it may take to do serial cognitive examinations. So I think these are some of the main reasons why the medical community is still focused on motor in terms of outcomes, both clinically when we give an intervention and also in the research setting. And so I show this as an example. This is data on SD809, or deuterated tetrabenazine, and I think even from the back of the room, you can see that there's a clear difference between those two lines. And so the fact that there's a difference, we can see what the intervention has done to chorea. So this is a motor outcome. And I think people look at this graph, they look at this type of intervention, excuse me, and can see that there's a difference, so it's measurable and is helpful in terms of bringing information forward. And so some of the more obvious questions that people have brought up about using motor outcomes: does it matter to patients as much as other symptoms? Is it as important to address chorea as it is for cognition, for example? Are the motor issues most important for causing disability? I think these are important questions that have been raised that are important to address, particularly if we're going to think about changing the criteria of how we look at things. And finally, actually two other points, actually. One was looking at predictors of extended care placement, so looking at nursing home placement, essentially. And when we looked at the entire Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, it was these items on the motor scale that predicted placement. Now, I think this is a little biased in terms of the conclusion. Motor variables alone predicted nursing home placement. I think anyone who's had someone go into a chronic care facility knows that it's a little easier to get in if it's purely a motor problem versus behavioral issues. There are many long-term care settings that hear about behavioral issues and turn the people away. So, but I think that this highlights the fact that the motor criteria are important to consider. Again, this isn't for diagnostic purposes, but it's something that's paid attention to throughout the course of the disease. And I think there's one final important point, and that is about disability. And as many of you probably know, the compassionate allowance listing basically fast tracks Huntington's disease, or adult onset Huntington's disease more specifically. And this is the criteria that they use for evaluation. And I just want to read that first line: treating physician records documenting progression of motor, cognitive, and psychiatric symptoms and signs. So they notice a progression over time, a change over time, a worsening, a family history of Huntington's disease, and there's an and there, not an or, and abnormal neurological exam findings consistent with Huntington's disease. And so really what they have interpreted this as is the motor exam predominantly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ross, who is going to expand on other aspects of Huntington's disease. And then hopefully we can answer your questions about this too.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk about a few different things, including a task force that I'm leading for the Movement Disorder Society that is actually focused on coming up with altered criteria and expanding the criteria. And I think that's hopefully going to make some of this discussion a little bit different in the future. So I just want to emphasize not just the motor problems, but the cognitive and emotional problems, I think everyone agrees, are key aspects of HD and part of the sort of clinical triad that we talk about when we diagnose and when we take care of HD patients. Just to remind us that the CAG repeat length helps predict age of onset, not perfectly, but can be used in predictive testing. And we're talking about people who are on the verge or becoming at the point where they can be diagnosed, then they're in what we call the pre-manifest period, and that brings us to the natural history of HD. Because of the CAG repeat, we can predict approximately when people will get it, and therefore we can study people who have the CAG repeat expansion but don't yet have diagnosable motor features of HD. And this summarizes a number of studies, including PREDICT and PHAROS and the TRACK-HD study, and this is sort of a typical HD individual who gets onset at age 45, again, motor onset, as you just heard about. And what this shows is that a number of features of the illness progress with time, including cognitive and motor features. Chorea actually tends to plateau. But importantly, these begin before we make the diagnosis of HD. And in addition, people begin to have functional decline before we make the diagnosis based on motor features. And furthermore, the brain begins to change. So this is from the PREDICT HD study. These are years before predicted onset. So all of these are people who have not yet had motor onset of HD. And you can see this is 20 years from predicted onset. These are far from onset, near middle way to onset, and near to onset. And you can see cross-sectionally, people have smaller, this is caudate volumes that's being measured here. People have smaller volumes cross-sectionally, and then these are 2 time points, the beginning of the study and then 2 years later, and you can see there's decline over time. So the brain begins to atrophy many years before we can make the diagnosis of HD. So again, kind of highlighting that we want to be doing is thinking about the earliest signs and symptoms of HD. So we would like to think about the other aspects of the disorder besides the motor disorder, the cognitive and the emotional features. And I'm just going to present some data from the PHAROS study because I think in a way this is the best data for how to understand these early changes. In the PHAROS study, people were followed for up to 10 years. They were all at risk for HD, but they had not necessarily been tested. In fact, they didn't want to be tested. They were tested as part of the study. But nobody knew whether or not they were going to be expansion positive or expansion negative. So this is the best and most objective measure of the different features of HD before diagnosis. And for each of these graphs, and I'm going to show them blown up a little bit so that you can see them, that the individuals were studied at time 0 and then for 9 years. Not always the same number of subjects, but a longitudinal study for 9 years, again, in people who had not yet been diagnosed with HD. And what you can see is that some things changed quite predictably, and other things did not change so predictably. And I just want to highlight the differences. So, for instance, the behavioral domain, meaning things like depression and irritability and apathy and the things which I think we all agree are very important and often cause a lot of difficulty in HD, just don't have a predictable relationship with the time before you're diagnosed. They can come at any time. In fact, depression is really well known to often come many years before the onset of motor Huntington's disease. Similarly, cognitive disorder did change over time. So but these are, sorry, I didn't clarify that. These are expansion negative individuals. These are expansion positive individuals. And you can see that over the course of the study, there is separation between the expansion negative and the expansion positive people. But there's a lot of variability, and it's not a straightforward, clear progression. By contrast, it turns out motor disorder, just by the score of the total motor score of the motor exam that you just heard about, really remarkably steadily and predictably increased over time with a dramatic separation between the expansion negative and the expansion positive individuals. And these little bars indicate the variability. And so you can see there's relatively little variability, relatively striking, strong separation. So this is one of the reasons, I think, now in retrospect, why we feel that the motor signs do provide an unusually clear and objective picture of what's going on in HD. And furthermore, in this study, there was already beginning to be functional changes. Now, the maximal score on the functional exam is 13, and this is actually 12 right here. The lowest score would be 0. So because these people are not yet diagnosed with HD, they're really having very, very minimal changes. But even so, you can see there is significant separation between the expansion positive and the expansion negative people. So again, highlighting that before we can make the motor diagnosis of HD, people are already beginning to have a number of these changes. It's just that the motor changes are the most predictable and steadily progressing. And this just highlights the comparison of the different domains, again, all in the same picture. Okay, so again, just to highlight, we currently make the diagnosis on the basis of the motor disorder primarily, and there's a very simple category in the International Classification of Diseases. HD is now G10, so that's a nice, very simple category. But what I want to also highlight is that's not the only way you can be diagnosed with an HD-related problem. So I'm a psychiatrist, and so I think especially about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders. That's keyed to the International Classification of Diseases. So a diagnosis of the cognitive disorder of HD is actually now, particularly with the new DSM-5, really very well defined. And so they now call loss of cognitive ability a neurocognitive disorder. The term used to be dementia, which kind of carried somewhat negative connotations. And they now divide it into major neurocognitive disorder and mild neurocognitive disorder, and that's in relationship to HD, and connecting it to HD is a specific subcategory. And I'm not going to go through the description in detail because it's complicated, but the main point is that major cognitive disorder involves significant cognitive decline from a previous level of ability with a substantial impairment in cognitive performance, including the ability to do kind of routine activities of daily living, such as paying bills, managing medications, things like that. So you can be diagnosed with neurocognitive disorder related to HD as a way of indicating that the cognitive disorder is there. And furthermore, in the DSM-5, there's now a term called mild neurocognitive disorder, which involves a modest impairment in cognitive problem, which means that you don't have any decrease in your performance, but it takes greater effort. And I think many people who have either had a family member with HD or who are expansion positive themselves know that the earliest cognitive difficulties are difficulties with attention, difficulties with concentration. People can perform the same tasks, but it requires more effort and maybe more time to do them. I also want to highlight that when we start talking about making the diagnosis based on cognitive criteria, it becomes actually quite complicated because testing cognition is expensive and complicated, and furthermore, people have such different levels of cognitive ability to start with that it can be very difficult to establish a change in cognition. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but just to show that even this little discussion of it shows a lot of complexity. So that's in contrast to the motor disorder, which, as I showed before, people normally don't have any chorea at all, so the appearance of any chorea or other extrapyramidal movement disorders is really a striking change for the vast majority of individuals. I also want to make one other point, and this is kind of still I think a point of discussion and some controversy, and that's the issue of what's the onset of the cognitive changes in relationship to the motor changes. And some people are very concerned that there may be a lot of people who have cognitive changes who don't have motor changes. So I actually went back and looked at our clinic population of over 100 people that we had followed longitudinally during the period when they became diagnosed or we saw shortly after they became diagnosable. And we asked the individuals, so the patients and the family, what they had noticed as the first problem. So this was not the doctor's judgment, this was the individual's judgment. And in almost all cases, they said that the motor, and I'm not going to explain the graph because it's a little complicated, but the conclusion was that in most cases, people felt that the cognitive and the motor problems had begun around the same time, and if anything, people tended to say that the motor problems tended to begin first. Now, there were some individuals who said that the cognitive problems began first, and I think it's important to highlight that because that may be an important subset of individuals. Okay, so this is some of the context. Taking this into account, taking what you might call the natural history of the disease into account, the Movement Disorder Society has set up a task force to look at the diagnostic criteria for HD and potentially come up with new ones. And it's based on the kind of a summary of the natural history we did a couple of years ago. And again, so this is the natural history, as I just described, the changes beginning before when we can make the motor onset, and also brain changes. So as our initial proposal, we are suggesting that there be a new category called prodromal HD. And you could discuss what the terms might be, but this is kind of what we came up with after some discussion. So as you saw in the, actually, let me just go back to the graph here. So when we make the motor diagnosis, there's a period where there's subtle changes and subtle decrease in function. We'd like to call that prodromal. There has also been the term pre-symptomatic, which has been used a lot for the period before when we make the diagnosis, but has been kind of not well defined. And so what we would like to do is define that as more specifically the time when there are literally no signs or symptoms. And so what we're saying is you can have manifest HD when you have the motor signs and symptoms and the diagnosis is made. And then there's the period before manifest HD, which we simply call pre-manifest. And we would now suggest dividing that into two periods. One, when you're truly pre-symptomatic, no signs or symptoms that are either detectable on exam or the individual's report. And then this period of prodromal HD, when people are beginning to have subtle signs and symptoms, but not enough that you can clearly say this is HD. And the reason that I think it's important to do this is, and important to get this into the International Classification of Diseases, is because then this period can become, you can make a diagnosis of prodromal HD even though you don't have manifest motor onset of HD. And if you have a little bit of irritability, a little bit of depression, you now have a diagnosis and a focus for treatment. This is just a suggestion, and as I'll show at the end, we're looking for feedback from people. So this, of course, trying to alter the diagnostic categories even a little bit, I mean, I don't think this is a major change, has a lot of implications. So for one thing, a lot more people are having genetic testing, so there's more people for whom these kinds of issues are relevant. I think it's very important for clinical care because, as I said, if you have prodromal HD, you may actually need symptomatic treatment for some of those problems. For research, I think it will help in getting clinical trials to go earlier and earlier, for instance, into the prodromal treatment. And then, of course, there's lots of implications in terms of the social services, education, et cetera. And I do want to say, it's important to understand that disability is distinct from the diagnosis. I mean, you have to, in some sense, have the diagnosis to have disability, but many people have the diagnosis of HD and are working and are doing very well, and so it's only when you become unable to work that the issue is disability. So these are very important and closely related issues, but I also want to highlight that there are some distinctions. So this is, I showed the reference, and I'll show the website in a second. I'm not going to go into the details. This is just our initial proposal for how we would define these three categories: pre-symptomatic, prodromal, and manifest. These are just proposals. The two things I think that are worth mentioning is that we would propose that manifest HD could be diagnosed a little bit earlier than it is currently, and it would be based on cognitive as well as motor features, and we would have this new category of prodromal HD. And again, this is the task force. These are the members of the task force. It's on the Movement Disorders website. I don't expect you to copy down this website, but if you just go to the Movement Disorders Society, it'll take you to that website. And we're really looking for comments and suggestions from people. I have to warn you, it's a little bit complicated. What you have to do is email someone in the Movement Disorders Society to get a password, and then you can get onto it. But I would really urge everyone to make comments. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give that background, and then I wanted to give a couple of examples as a way of kind of getting us thinking about some of the different possibilities. So these are a few, these are kind of made up examples, but they're based on the clinical experience we've had at Hopkins. So here's one individual, 55-year-old man at risk for HD. He's concerned about difficulty with memory and concentration. He's having difficulty at work, whereas he's a systems engineer, so he's got a highly cognitively challenging job supervising many people on projects. He has not noticed any movement problems. His mental status exam is fully within normal limits. He had one minor error at doing serial sevens, you know, where you subtract 7 from 100 and then keep on going. Would you think this might be HD or not? What do you think? HD? Not HD? Any? Just. Yeah, so I see a few hands. Maybe you guys are shy, but so when doing some further examination, we found that his wife said, well, gosh, his concentration and memory has actually been slowly decreasing and steadily decreasing from a previous baseline over two or 3 years. He has, in fact, had some twitchy movements. He hasn't noticed them, and maybe some incoordination. He drops things a bit. And then on neurologic exam, he had subtle but clear signs of Huntington's disease, and all the things that Dr. Frank just mentioned, a little bit of eye movement problems, a little bit of incoordinated movements, and some subtle but noticeable chorea, so that his total motor score was 22. Now, the motor score runs from 0 to 100. We usually make the diagnosis. There's no fixed cutoff, but if someone has kind of typical signs and symptoms and no history that would suggest something else, at least in my center, we tend to make the diagnosis around 15 or 20 points. So this is someone who has pretty clear HD. On testing, his CAG repeat was 40. And so this is early HD. So this is kind of a typical case of someone who has early HD. And the point I want to make here is that the individual had not noticed any motor changes, but had only noticed the cognitive changes, because that's really, it's the cognitive changes for many people, particularly if you have a cognitively challenging job, that cause the most problem. But in fact, this person had motor signs, and so it was very easy to write a letter saying this person has HD, and he might want to apply for disability. Okay, here's another individual, very similar. I've just changed a couple of things. 55-year-old man at risk for HD, concerned about difficulty with memory and concentration. He's doing okay at work, where he's a systems engineer, but it takes him longer to achieve his goals. He, again, has not noticed any movement problems. The mental status exam is the same. Is this HD? I won't make you raise your hands. So in this case, the information from his wife is that he's kind of a worrier, and really his memory and concentration have not been so different, but he's maybe a little bit more irritable. The memory and concentration changes are subtle. In his case, the neurologic exam showed really just a very few points, a very few, very subtle changes with a total motor score of only 6. So what we would propose, and in the diagnostic confidence scheme, we might give him a diagnostic confidence of 2. But based on the history and the fact that this is a change and that he has a CAG expansion, this, I think, would be the kind of case that you would diagnose with prodromal HD. And the value in doing that is, even though you can't say he absolutely clearly has motor HD, he's having some changes, for instance, irritability, which could become the focus of attention and could be the object of either pharmacologic or behavioral treatment. Okay, I want to show a couple of other cases. So here's a 10-year-old kid. He's at risk for HD. He's not doing well in school. He's never been especially good at sports, but now he's maybe even a little bit worse. He's always picked last, you know, when they pick teams. Actually, I don't know if they do that anymore. He's also kind of lost interest in some of his usual activities. This fellow has no chorea at all. Is this HD? Well, On mental status exam, there's no sign of depression, though he's kind of lost interest in things, and his cognitive function is a little hard to know for a 10-year-old, but it seems to be less than what you would expect. And when we do the neurologic exam, he has no chorea, but he has really clear and dramatic signs of HD. He has abnormal eye movements, he has slow and stiff movements, he has considerable incoordination of rapid alternating movements, and his motor score is 38. So that's, again, on the 0 to 120 range. That's someone kind of in the mild, almost the moderate to HD range. So this, and he had CAG repeat testing that showed a fairly long expansion. In the 40s is the typical adult onset range. This is in the 50s. So this is clear early onset HD, and I just wanted to make the point that you don't have to have chorea to have a very strong motor dysfunction, which is consistent with HD. Okay, one final case. 30-year-old woman, positive for the CAG repeat expansion, so she's had predictive testing. She's very concerned because she's having serious problems with memory and concentration and abnormal movements. Her husband is very worried about personality changes, moodiness, and she's just really not functioning well at work. In fact, she's had poor evaluations and warning about her work performance. So she's really had a clear decrement in her performance. Is this HD? Well, turns out on mental status exam, she's very sad. She blames herself for what she considers to be these failures that she's had. She's lost interest in her usual activities. She notes fatigue and very poor sleep with early morning awakening, which is characteristic of depression. So these are all kind of the cardinal features of a major depression when we examine someone. And the neurologic exam was completely normal. She had a slight tremor, but she drinks a lot of coffee because she's having trouble sleeping, and so she drinks a lot of coffee in the morning. On review of genetic testing, her CAG expansion was 39, so she did have the positive expansion, remember, but this is a repeat length which is really predictive of quite late onset, not early onset, and remember this woman is only 30. So in this case, the diagnosis is depression. The depression would completely resolve with treatment in most cases, and in her case, we would not expect the onset of progressive motor and cognitive features of HD really for 20 years or more. So the point I want to make is that it's very important to look at each individual case individually because there's lots of differences in presentation, both of HD and people who are CAG expansion positive but don't yet have HD and have instead another treatable condition. So at least the conclusions I'd like to suggest is, as we know, of course, HD involves a change in motor, cognitive, and emotional features. And it's important to know that the natural history, that is the evolution of the signs and symptoms, can be very different in different people, though cognitive and motor changes are the most predictable and the most progressive, the most reliably changing. The emotional changes are much less predictable. But onset is always slow and gradual, so there's no day when you go to bed the night before and you don't have HD and you wake up and you do have HD. It's always a many-year process, and therefore we'd like to propose refining the diagnostic categories based on the natural history and including a prodromal, a category of prodromal HD to take that into account. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have left some time for questions and discussion. Why don't you come on and we'll get your feedback. What do you think? Yeah, you in the back.
Yes, sir. The question I have is, with the cognitive and the motor skills, does the environment have any effect, say like heat, cold, dehydration, lack of vitamins or anything like that? And then on the cognitive skills, first with the highly technical job, my son is an airplane
Okay, now hold on a sec, because I think
So-
you've got about 3 different questions
Exactly.
there.
So we're going to repeat all the questions anyway so that everyone can hear it and for the camera. But the first question you asked is, can environmental influences bring on the onset of symptoms of Huntington's disease? Is that your first question? Do I have that correct?
Yes.
Okay. The CAG repeat number gives us an idea about what age people are going to express symptoms. But there are other factors that predict that as well, and that's what we're trying to sort out. Are there other gene influences, these epigenetic type of influences on the one gene? Are there environmental influences? And I don't think we have a clear answer for that right now. I think the only thing I've looked at, just because it comes up so often, is head trauma. Does head trauma bring on the onset? And generally speaking, the answer is no.
Yeah, I think it's clear that there are genetic influences besides the CAG repeat length on age of onset. Environmental influences have not been really clearly identified. The one thing is that fatigue and stress will always bring out worse problems with movement and cognition. And then let's see, what were the other questions?
The other question,
So what about baseline cognitive function, and if you have a high-level cognitive job? So one of the interesting things is when you're trying to define if someone has what used to be called dementia, what we now call neurocognitive changes, you have to compare to the baseline. So you have some people who are very highly educated and highly intelligent who do great on neuropsychological testing. They're well within normal limits, but it's a clear decline from their previous level of function. And so that would represent neurocognitive changes or dementia. And then you always have to take into account what the job is. So we've had people who were railroad engineers or airline pilots or other sort of highly sensitive jobs. And of course, for people like that, the criteria for when the HD is interfering with your function are going to be different than someone who has a different kind of job. Yeah, other questions?
How does all this factor into the wording in the Parity Act?
So the question is how all this factors into the wording of the Parity Act. Well, I mean, I think that when we're talking about any type of regulatory body, they're going to start off with the person is diagnosed with Huntington's disease. And so for the pre-symptomatic, people who are gene positive, not yet symptomatic, not in that prodromal, I think that the Parity Act is not going to necessarily apply. It's for people that are symptomatic with Huntington's disease. So I think it's important in terms of when the clock starts for disability insurance purposes and really any type of regulation or regulatory bodies.
Yeah, but I always answer questions like that by prefacing that I'm not a lawyer, and those kind of questions usually need to go to a lawyer for a definitive answer.
True.
Yeah.
One question has to do basically with the Parity Act as well. When I first realized that Huntington's was grouped in this category of disorders called movement disorders, I was kind of surprised. This was a number of years ago because I've had a long enough personal experience with it to know that it was much more than that. And I wonder if putting this in that bucket of movement disorders, if that handicaps us even further with Medicare, Social Security, and legislation in terms of it being perceived or continuing to be perceived as only a movement disorder, because there's just this term that is applied to that as well as others.
Well, so again, I don't want to comment on the law, but I think the fact that the DSM, which is the psychiatric manual, has really so clearly defined the cognitive changes with HD, I think really is a big plus, because that's now much more clearly defined and more clearly perceived. The other thing is there's some advantages to having the movement as identified as primary, just because they are so objective and so measurable. But I think it's a complex question, and I think this is why we need more discussion. So Elizabeth McCusker, who's one of the physicians on the task force that I discussed, she says, well, you could just as easily define Huntington's disease as a cognitive disorder that has a lot of movements, and I think it's a matter of definition.
Yeah, I agree, and I hear what you're saying in terms of putting all these disorders under one bucket of movement disorders, and it excludes other aspects. But I think anyone who treats Huntington's, Parkinson's, those disorders, we know it's a lot more than just a movement disorder. And similarly in terms...
People that are actually using their intellect to understand. I'm worried about the political level that are just looking at the
Sure.
surface and making extreme comments and not understanding.
Right. So, I mean, I hope that the people that are making the decisions do get input from the community, whether it's the general public, from providers, so that the emphasis is not just on the movement side, but that it's a triad, that it's more than just movement. And, you know, I think in the medical community, we know that it's more than just movement. And same thing in terms of dementia, a third of people with Alzheimer's have motor signs. So these are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Good point about Alzheimer's. Yeah, in the back there?
See the curve going further and further to the left as we see more and more sensitive testing and MRIs and whatnot?
Yeah. So a very interesting question. So my own, there are some data from Pagnopoulos at Iowa.
So repeat.
So I'm sorry. We're seeing earlier and earlier changes. How much earlier can it go? For instance, might HD be considered a developmental disorder? So there's some data from Pagnopoulos suggesting that even very early on, there are differences in people who are expansion positive versus expansion negative. But at least, I think in most clinicians' experience, and if you look at the data from the big studies, if you go far enough back, certainly clinically and cognitively, people look entirely normal. Even if you look at the brain imaging, the atrophy begins on the order of 10 to 15 years prior to onset. Junhua, who just spoke at the previous session at Hopkins, and many other people have been showing functional changes earlier. But there does seem to be a period where people are not just pre-symptomatic, but seem entirely normal. I think, you know, we still need to look at that, but that's at least my view of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I would just add that at least right now, as it stands today in terms of therapeutics, pushing that curve to the left and finding objective changes earlier is important to get set up for potential treatments in the future, because as soon as we have something that may delay the onset or change the course of the disease, if sooner that we can pick up any of these changes, the better it is to intervene.
Other questions?
So the category of prodromal is mainly focused on starting treatments earlier for patients. Is that why
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
necessary?
So why have a category of prodromal? It's really for a couple of different reasons. It's to focus on this period when changes are beginning, so that symptomatic treatments can be given. So, for instance, the case that I showed where there was a bit of irritability, that can now be the focus of treatment. And a doctor can be reimbursed for it, and an insurance company will pay for it. But also, the goal would be to focus research more on that earlier category, so that more studies would be aimed at delaying the onset of HD rather than just slowing the progression of HD.
Can I add one more question to that? So if there's a person that is at risk, but they don't want to have the test, they don't want the test, how would you get that person into your study if they don't want to know?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, yeah, what about people who don't want to be tested? Well, we actually, you may not have seen, there's actually two columns. On the left is people who are genetically confirmed. On the right is people who are not genetically confirmed. Because I think it's very important to be able to make the diagnosis even if you haven't had genetic confirmation.
Right.
And to treat that person. Now, that person may not be so interested in treatment, and they may not have been tested, but at least it's important to be able to make the diagnosis. So I think we have a little bit higher threshold for making the diagnosis if someone hasn't been genetically tested. But yes, same categories would apply. Other questions? Yeah, question in the back there? You're asking something about why do some people get it earlier and other people later? Is that right? Yeah. Well, there's two things that work. One is the length of the CAG repeat, which predicts about 50 to 70% of the variability in the age of onset. And then there are additional genes whose location has been mapped, but the exact genes haven't been identified, the so-called modifier genes. Those are the two known aspects. And then there's other factors that we just don't know yet. Did you have another question?
Her number is 45.
45, yeah. So 45 is an adult onset length, and you have to look at the table, but I think the typical age of onset would be about 35 or 40, but a lot of variability. For that length of repeat, a lot of variability. Yeah, so let's see, someone who hasn't asked a question yet?
Right up here.
Yeah.
You were saying testing someone or someone that doesn't want to get tested to participate in the studies. Probably some of you heard my story already. I'm a fifth generation I tested negative, but because I have lived this for all my life, including since my grandma, my father, my aunts, uncles, everybody, I still think that I have something that you call mental HD, that you learn and then you start like imitating, even though you don't have it. Until this day, I tested negative, but I have a lot of things that I see that they're very similar to my family that is positive.
Yeah.
And it's even hard for me to understand that I don't have it when I keep telling, I work very direct with Dr. Corey Bloom because she's treated all of my family. And before I got tested, I will go and say, Dr. Corey Bloom, I'm positive. And she would say, no, you're not.
So the question is, what about if you test negative, but you still feel like you have some features of HD and you've learned kind of the idea of, incorporated into your thinking the idea of being at risk and maybe positive. And I think what that shows is how complex all these things are. And part of what is important is growing up in an environment of a family that has HD. And that's why, so you're a key part of the research, because what we want to do are compare people who have been at risk and have grown up at risk but test negative with those people who have been at risk and grown up at risk but test positive. And that's what, for instance, what the Faro study was especially about.
But I think that what has happened with you highlights that Huntington's disease is a family disease. It's not an individual disease. So, and it can impact people gene positive or gene negative that grow up in that environment.
Other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to give you a little feedback as somebody who's probably squarely in that prodromal stage. I like having that defined. I mean, it's just been.
I'm sorry, did you say you do or do not like having that defined?
No, I do.
Mm-hmm.
I do. It's just been such a weird thing to have to try and explain. I mean, even my wife sometimes forgets, were you diagnosed, were you not diagnosed? No, I'm not. Why, so it's nice to have a medical definition of that. And I don't know that it really necessarily applies to what you can mean, because I'm pretty tied into the great center of excellence. And my treatment's not going to change any depending on what you call it. But I wonder if that isn't going to have a positive impact for people who aren't working with specialists that live, eat, and breathe this stuff. Are their doctors going to have a better understanding?
Yeah, so to repeat the question, basically some positive feedback that the idea of a diagnosis of prodromal HD could be helpful, because it could help people get treatment, particularly if they're not at a center of excellence. And well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
We'd like to, so I'd like to hear lots of positive feedback, but I'd also like to hear, if people have other ideas or think that's not such a great idea, or have other suggestions, we'd like to hear that also. Let's see, you, then you in the back.
I had a question to the prior conversation. Is it been determined if you inherit from a male versus a female gender base, whether that is a cause for an increase in the number of repeats?
Yes, yes. So that's something that's very well known. The question is, if you inherit it from a father versus a mother, does the repeat length change? And if you inherit it from a mother, on average, you get the same repeat length. There's some variability, but it can go down almost as much as it goes up. Whereas if you inherit it from a father, the tendency is to go up, not always, but the tendency is to go up, and occasionally even to go up a lot, so that you can have even juvenile onset after adult onset, and that phenomenon is called anticipation. It's one of the really striking features of the genetics of HD.
I thought someone was telling me that they'd never heard of that, but anyways, that
Yeah.
being said,
So that-
are you finding that the median age of onset may be changing as a result of that, if half the population roughly is male?
Yeah, yeah. So, interesting question at a population level. So the question is, would the average age of onset tend to be decreasing? And my understanding of it is that in some families, the age of onset will be decreasing when there's male transmission, but there are occasional new mutations where it expands from the very high end of normal into the HD range. So there actually are new mutations for HD. And so therefore, my understanding is the frequency of HD, that is the prevalence of HD in the population, could stay about the same, and the average age of onset could stay about the same. But I should also say that you'd have to study in a population over many generations to know that.
Which hasn't been done yet.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let's see, the lady in the back and then the man in front of her.
When you're seeing these patients, and especially the ones that have tested positive, but they don't seem to want to be told that they have a problem, are you seeing a lot of mind moving matters with these patients? And
So
sometimes they're perfectly convinced they have it, and so they're having a more trouble.
you want to repeat the
Yeah,
question?
I just want to make sure I understand the question. So it's in people who are at risk, are we seeing mind over matter? Are we seeing them, in a sense, what they think is controlling their symptoms? In people who are at risk, they don't know their gene status. Do I have that correct? Some of them, exactly. Well, at risk means by definition that they don't know their gene status, and it is a complex question. So people who are gene positive often are on the lookout for symptoms that may emerge that may or may not be related. So in the example of someone who's drinking a lot of coffee and has tremor, for example, and someone who's gene negative may also be on the lookout if they're at risk. And for various reasons may be convinced that they have similar symptoms, or may have some of the similar symptoms, but it's not attributable to Huntington's disease. So we see both.
Yeah, and it should also be mentioned that just because you have the CAG expansion mutation, that doesn't make you immune to traumatic brain injury or stroke or other neurologic conditions. So part of what's involved in an evaluation for HD is not just doing the genetic test and the exam and saying, oh, this is HD, but also is thinking about other possible causes of neurologic symptoms. And really the main reason we do an MRI, if we do one, is to exclude other things rather than to include HD. There was, yeah.
My understanding is that there's no greater likelihood of HD manifesting in a man versus a woman. And I also have the sense that within a family there aren't like strains in which it's more likely for a man to develop it than a woman. Is that correct, or have you seen any families that, all the women get it but none of the men, or vice versa?
So the question is it essentially, is it more likely that men or women are going to get Huntington's disease? And yeah, so even within families, I mean, there are families where it's predominantly the women or predominantly the men, but it's really by chance. So it is not on a chromosome that's associated with sex. So it is really by chance that happens. It's equal in men and women.
Question here?
No, just some positive feedback in relation to what he had said. As somebody who's gene positive, not near the center of excellence, I have gone to like local neurologists to say, well, I want to be on top of this and I want to get symptoms tracked as soon as I possibly can so I can get ahead of it. And they're saying that I'm so young that I'm almost being overexcited about it, and as something with an between pre-symptomatic and between manifestation, as that being there, I think it almost gives it credence.
So again, positive feedback on the idea of a prodromal HD diagnosis. Thank you. Yeah.
Again, positive feedback for the prodrome. To me, it's almost like the stage 0 with some of the cancer staging. Very similarly, because my husband was air traffic controller and cognitive showed up much earlier. And almost 30 years before symptoms, he had an MRI that showed increased ventricular size. So there are definitely people out there with that early symptomology or barely symptomology that really can use that type of model.
Yeah, I like the cancer analogy because it acknowledges that cancer is present, but that is at a very early stage. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, and you might even imagine as time goes on that we would have even additional kind of distinctions based perhaps on biomarkers, but I think we're not at that stage yet. Yeah.
Chris, are you at all worried that the prodromal category finds its way into the medical nomenclature, that these subjects might be at risk for increased discrimination in the workplace?
Yeah, yeah.
I know you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, so important question. I think this is really one of the big issues. If people are getting a diagnosis of prodromal HD, is there the risk of genetic discrimination? I think you have to say yes. I think this is one of the concerns about HD, and I think, on the other hand, we can't make HD go away, and for some people it may be beneficial. I think there will still be many people who don't want to get tested and don't want to bring it forward, but I think for some people where it's troublesome, this will give them the opportunity to get a diagnosis. But I think that's one of the really important questions and reservations and issues that need to be discussed. I don't know what your thoughts about that are.
I completely agree. I think it doesn't matter at what stage the symptoms or testing is going on. That discrimination always has to be a concern.
Yeah. Especially in the U.S. Maybe it's different in different places, and actually the task force that I mentioned has people from all over the world, from every continent except Antarctica, I think, so that we can actually take into account, all these the differences in different places. Any final questions? I think we're kind of coming to the end of the session. Any final burning questions? Well, this has really been extremely helpful, and thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for your time and attention.